He saved her life without asking for anything in return. But days later, fate kept bringing them together again and again, until the billionaire realized the waitress had become the one person he couldn't live without. Sometimes, the most important decision you'll ever make is one nobody else even notices. The ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, where polished marble reflected the warm glow of golden lights, and every table carried fresh white roses arranged with quiet perfection. It was the annual Brooks Foundation Charity Gala, one of Manhattan's most anticipated evenings, where executives, philanthropists, and community leaders gathered beneath the same elegant roof, each conversation blending into the soft melody of a live string quartet. Daniel Brooks barely noticed any of it. At 39, the billionaire founder of Brooks Capital had spent enough evenings like this to know every speech sounded alike. Every handshake followed the same script, and every carefully rehearsed smile disappeared the moment business entered the room. He accepted another greeting with practiced courtesy before excusing himself toward the quieter edge of the ballroom, hoping for a moment of silence before his scheduled remarks. Across the room, Emily Carter adjusted the sleeve of her black serving jacket and balanced a polished silver tray with practiced confidence. Her shift had started before noon, and after nearly 10 hours on her feet, every step reminded her how tired she was. Still, no guest would ever notice. She greeted each table with the same gentle smile, refilled glasses before anyone asked, and thanked every person who looked up long enough to acknowledge her presence. Most never did. That was simply part of the job. She had learned years ago that kindness should never depend on whether someone was paying attention. As she passed another table, an elderly couple quietly thanked her for remembering that one of them preferred sparkling water with lemon. Emily smiled warmly. Of course, I remembered from earlier. The woman squeezed her hand with grateful eyes, and Emily continued on before anyone else needed her. Daniel happened to witness the exchange. It lasted no more than 5 seconds, yet something about it lingered. There was no performance in her kindness, no expectation of applause, just genuine attention to another human being. He found himself watching her for another moment before turning away, almost embarrassed by his own curiosity. The evening moved forward with effortless precision. Waiters carried polished trays through clusters of conversations, while photographers captured generous donors posing beside oversized checks destined for tomorrow's headlines. Somewhere near the orchestra, laughter echoed across the ballroom. Everything appeared exactly as it should, until one small detail refused to fit. Daniel reached for a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray, but paused. Emily had just accepted another tray from a catering assistant near the service entrance. The exchange itself seemed ordinary, yet the young assistant immediately disappeared through the side doors without making eye contact with anyone. Daniel's attention drifted naturally toward the tray Emily now carried. Most of the glasses matched perfectly. One did not. It had been placed slightly off-center, its garnish different from the others, almost carelessly rushed into position. He couldn't explain why his instincts sharpened. Years of negotiating billion-dollar deals had taught him that major problems often arrived disguised as tiny inconsistencies. Emily approached a table near the silent auction display. She lifted the unusual glass with the same calm professionalism she showed every guest, preparing to deliver it without the slightest suspicion. Daniel glanced around. Nobody else appeared to notice anything unusual. Conversations continued. Cameras flashed. The quartet played softly. Every second stretched a little longer than the last. Emily turned, carrying the glass toward another guest waiting near the ballroom entrance. Daniel's heartbeat slowed instead of quickened, the way it always did when certainty replaced doubt. He didn't know exactly what was wrong. He only knew he couldn't ignore the feeling. Without hesitation, he crossed the ballroom, his polished dress shoes barely making a sound against the marble floor. Emily looked up just as he reached her. "Excuse me," Daniel said with calm politeness, offering a reassuring smile that revealed none of his concern. "I think one of your guests is asking for you over there." She instinctively turned her head toward the direction he indicated. In that single, quiet moment, Daniel gently lifted the glass from her tray and replaced it with another identical one from a nearby serving station before anyone around them realized anything had changed. Emily looked back, slightly confused. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't see anyone." Daniel simply smiled. Looks like I was mistaken. My apologies. She returned the smile with the same quiet grace she had offered everyone else that evening. No worries. It happens. She continued walking, completely unaware that her evening, and perhaps her entire future, had just taken a different path because one stranger chose to trust a feeling that no one else even noticed. Emily Carter finished the remainder of her shift exactly the way she had started it, moving quietly through the ballroom with steady hands and an unhurried smile. The small misunderstanding with the distinguished guest faded from her thoughts almost immediately. Customers occasionally pointed in the wrong direction or mistook one server for another. It was hardly memorable. By the time the last dessert plates disappeared and the musicians packed away their instruments, she had already filed the moment away among 1,000 ordinary encounters that came with working in hospitality. Outside, the crisp Manhattan air greeted her as she wrapped her light gray coat tighter around her shoulders. It was almost 11 o'clock. The city still hummed with life, yellow taxis rolling through rain-polished streets while office towers reflected thousands of lights against the night sky. Emily declined a ride offered by one of her co-workers with a grateful smile. She preferred the subway. It gave her 20 quiet minutes to think before another busy day began. As the train carried her downtown, she opened the notes application on her aging phone and reviewed tomorrow's schedule. Morning hospital visit. Afternoon grocery shopping. Evening. Shift at the restaurant. Every hour already belonged to someone else. She did not complain. She simply organized her days the way other people organized meetings. Early the next morning, sunlight filtered through the narrow windows of St. Margaret Medical Center. Emily walked through the familiar hallway carrying a small paper bag that held homemade blueberry muffins and a paperback mystery novel borrowed from the public library. She stopped outside room 412 before gently knocking twice. "Good morning, Dad." Robert Carter looked up from the crossword puzzle resting on his lap. His silver hair had grown thinner over the past few years, yet his smile remained exactly the same. "You came before work again." Emily placed the muffins beside his bed and adjusted the blanket that had slipped toward the floor. "I promised I would not miss Thursdays." Robert laughed softly. "You keep too many promises." She shrugged with quiet amusement. "Someone has to keep you out of trouble." They spent the next 40 minutes talking about ordinary things. A neighbor's new golden retriever. The Yankees. A recipe Robert insisted he remembered better than any cookbook. Not once did Emily mention how carefully she stretched every paycheck or how exhausted she often felt by the end of each week. Her father had enough to carry already. Across the city, Daniel Brooks stood inside the glass conference room overlooking Midtown Manhattan. Financial reports covered the enormous screen while senior executives debated quarterly projections. Normally, Daniel noticed every number, every inconsistency, every opportunity. This morning, however, his attention wandered unexpectedly. He remembered the waitress who thanked every guest with the same sincere expression, whether they donated $5 or $5 million. He remembered the elderly couple smiling because she had remembered something so small. Most of all, he remembered the strange feeling that had compelled him to replace a single glass without fully understanding why. During a pause in the meeting, his chief of security quietly entered the room. "You asked me to review the charity event footage." Daniel nodded. "Anything unusual?" The security chief hesitated before placing a tablet on the polished conference table. "One thing." Daniel watched several camera angles replay across the screen. Catering staff moved efficiently through the ballroom until one unfamiliar temporary worker briefly appeared near the beverage station. The identification badge was partially hidden beneath an apron, and within less than 30 seconds, the individual exited through a service corridor that no assigned employee had been scheduled to use. "Did anyone identify that worker?" Daniel asked calmly. "Not yet. The staffing agency has no record matching the uniform." Daniel remained silent. The uneasy feeling returned, stronger now. Whatever had caught his attention the previous evening had not been simple intuition. Something truly had been out of place. Yet Emily herself remained completely unaware. At that very moment, she was helping her father finish his crossword puzzle, laughing because he insisted that every 7-letter answer somehow ended with the word baseball. Daniel looked once more at the frozen image of the young waitress carrying the silver tray through the crowded ballroom. Thousands of people had attended the gala. Hundreds had spoken with him. Yet the only face he could remember clearly belonged to someone who had expected nothing from him at all. He closed the tablet slowly. "Find out who that temporary worker was," he said quietly. "And do not involve Miss Carter unless it becomes absolutely necessary." The security chief nodded before leaving the room. Daniel walked toward the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city below. Somewhere among millions of people, a waitress had already returned to her ordinary life, believing yesterday had been just another shift. He had a feeling it was anything but ordinary. 3 days passed, yet Daniel Brooks found himself thinking about a woman whose last name he had learned only because he had quietly asked his security team to identify everyone working the charity gala. It irritated him more than he cared to admit. His calendar remained filled from sunrise until well after sunset with board meetings, investment reviews, and charitable initiatives, but every now and then his thoughts drifted back to Emily Carter. Not because she had done anything extraordinary that evening. Quite the opposite. She had simply carried herself with a quiet steadiness that seemed increasingly rare in a city where everyone appeared to be performing for someone else. Late Friday afternoon, Daniel received a secure message from his head of security. The investigation was complete. The unidentified temporary catering worker had used falsified employment credentials and disappeared before the event officially ended. Surveillance footage from nearby streets showed the individual entering a vehicle with stolen license plates that had later been abandoned in another borough. Local authorities had been notified, but there was no immediate public concern because the incident had never reached the guests. Daniel read every page without speaking. Near the end of the report, one sentence caught his attention. Investigators believe the altered beverage had likely been intended for a female executive scheduled to stand near the charity auction display. Emily had unknowingly taken the wrong tray only moments before serving the drink. She had never been the intended recipient. She had simply been one small accident away from becoming part of someone else's mistake. Daniel slowly closed the folder. The realization brought him no comfort. Chance had placed Emily in the wrong place at the wrong time, and instinct alone had prompted him to intervene. He rarely believed in coincidence, yet he struggled to explain what had happened any other way. Across the city, Emily finished another lunch shift at the neighborhood restaurant where she worked on weekends. Unlike the glamorous ballroom, this place welcomed teachers, construction workers, retired couples, and families celebrating little victories that never appeared in newspapers. She enjoyed those customers most. They remembered names instead of titles. As she wiped down a booth near the front window, an elderly man entered carrying 2 overfilled grocery bags. One of the paper handles suddenly tore, sending apples, canned soup, and a loaf of bread rolling across the floor. Several customers looked over before returning to their meals. Emily immediately set down her towel and hurried across the room. "Do not worry," she said gently while kneeling beside the scattered groceries. "We will have everything picked up in just a minute." The man looked embarrassed. "I should have packed lighter." Emily smiled. "Or perhaps someone should invent stronger grocery bags." The simple joke drew a quiet laugh from him. She carefully checked each apple before placing it into a fresh, reusable bag that the restaurant kept behind the counter for customers who needed one. She refused the $5 he tried to hand her. "Please keep it," she said. "Maybe buy yourself a cup of coffee tomorrow." The man thanked her twice before slowly making his way back outside. Emily returned to work as though nothing unusual had happened. She never noticed the black sedan parked across the street. Daniel had not intended to stop there. Traffic had simply forced his driver to wait at the intersection while a delivery truck blocked the lane ahead. Looking through the passenger window, he had recognized the restaurant's familiar sign from the catering company listed in the gala program. Then he saw Emily inside. He watched her gather the fallen groceries with the same quiet patience she had shown everyone at the charity event. There were no cameras, no influential donors, no opportunity to impress anyone important. She behaved exactly the same when nobody significant appeared to be watching. Daniel leaned back in his seat without saying a word. His driver finally pulled away as traffic began moving again, but Daniel continued looking through the rear window until the restaurant disappeared behind the crowded streets of Manhattan. He realized something that unsettled him more than any business risk ever had. He had spent years evaluating people by achievements, credentials, and measurable success. Emily Carter seemed to possess something that could not be measured on any financial statement. She made ordinary moments feel important simply by paying attention to the people everyone else overlooked. And for reasons he could not yet explain, that was becoming impossible for him to forget. Saturday morning arrived wrapped in cool autumn sunshine, and Manhattan seemed to breathe a little slower than it did during the workweek. Street vendors arranged fresh flowers along the sidewalks. Families pushed strollers through neighborhood parks, and small coffee shops welcomed regular customers who already knew one another by name. Emily Carter appreciated mornings like these because they reminded her that life was built from ordinary moments rather than extraordinary ones. After leaving St. Margaret Medical Center, where she had spent another quiet hour with her father, she stopped at the neighborhood grocery store before walking toward Riverside Park with 2 reusable bags filled with simple necessities. Near one of the walking paths, she noticed an elderly woman standing alone beside a park bench, turning slowly in circles while holding a folded piece of paper with trembling hands. People walked past without stopping. Some assumed she was waiting for someone. Others simply had somewhere else to be. Emily slowed her pace. Something about the woman's uncertain expression reminded her of patience she had often seen visiting her father. She approached with a gentle smile that carried no urgency. "Good morning. Are you all right?" The woman looked relieved the moment someone spoke to her. "I think I am lost," she admitted quietly. "I was trying to find my daughter's apartment, but every street suddenly looks the same." Emily sat beside her on the bench instead of standing over her. "There is no rush. Let us figure it out together." She unfolded the small piece of paper. A handwritten address appeared beside a phone number, but one digit had been smudged by moisture. Emily called the number anyway. No answer. She tried again 5 minutes later while keeping the conversation light, asking about the woman's grandchildren and favorite places in the city. Slowly, the anxiety disappeared from the older woman's face. Nearly 20 minutes later, a worried young woman came running across the park, her eyes filling with relief the instant she recognized her mother. "Mom!" she exclaimed before embracing her carefully. She turned toward Emily with gratitude that words struggled to express. "Thank you. I have been searching everywhere." Emily simply smiled. She was never alone. The daughter insisted on offering money for the kindness, but Emily politely declined. "Please spend it on lunch together instead." Mother and daughter walked away hand in hand, stopping only once to wave goodbye. Emily picked up her grocery bags and continued toward the subway station as though nothing remarkable had happened. She never noticed the familiar black sedan parked across the street. Daniel Brooks had spent the morning visiting a community youth center supported by one of his charitable foundations. The event had ended earlier than expected, and his driver had chosen the quieter route through Riverside Park to avoid weekend traffic. Daniel happened to glance through the window just as Emily sat beside the elderly woman. He watched the entire exchange without interrupting. There was no audience, no publicity, no opportunity for recognition. She gave away nearly half an hour of her day to help someone she had never met and expected nothing in return. Daniel remained silent long after the car pulled away. His executive assistant, seated beside him, noticed his thoughtful expression. "Everything all right?" she asked. Daniel continued looking out the window. "Do you know what surprises me most?" She shook her head. "Most people become generous after they have enough time or enough money. She is generous even when she clearly has very little of either." His assistant followed his gaze toward the disappearing figure carrying 2 grocery bags. "Someone you know?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Not yet." Back at Brooks Capital that afternoon, another acquisition proposal waited for his approval, but the numbers blurred together in front of him. Instead of reviewing spreadsheets, he found himself remembering Emily's patient voice as she spoke with the frightened elderly woman. She had never tried to solve the problem quickly. She had simply stayed. Daniel leaned back in his chair and quietly realized something that no financial report had ever taught him. Success often measured how many lives a person could influence. Character was measured by how one treated the single person standing directly in front of them. For the first time in many years, he wondered whether he had spent too much of his life chasing the first while overlooking the second. Monday arrived with gray clouds hanging low above Manhattan, and the steady rhythm of another workweek returned as though the quiet moments of the weekend had never happened. Emily Carter tied her apron behind her back inside the neighborhood restaurant just before 7 in the morning. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the dining room while the first regular customers settled into their usual booths. Mr. Henderson unfolded the newspaper exactly as he did every weekday. Mrs. Lewis ordered oatmeal with cinnamon before Emily even reached the table. Familiar faces, familiar conversations, familiar kindness. She appreciated routines because they reminded her that even difficult lives could still hold steady ground. Between breakfast orders, her phone vibrated softly inside her apron pocket. It was a message from St. Margaret Medical Center. Her father's physical therapy session had gone better than expected, and he had managed several more steps with his walker than he had the previous week. Emily closed her eyes for a brief second and smiled with quiet relief. It was not a miracle. It was only progress. But progress had become something worth celebrating. She slipped the phone away and continued serving coffee with renewed energy. Nearly an hour later, a young mother entered carrying a restless little boy who could not have been older than 6. The child looked frustrated as he stared at the breakfast menu. Emily noticed immediately that he was wearing hearing aids. She knelt beside the table until she was at eye level with him instead of speaking from above. She pointed gently toward the pictures on the children's menu, speaking slowly and clearly while smiling warmly. The little boy relaxed almost instantly. His mother watched with visible gratitude. "Most people rush him," she said quietly after placing the order. Emily shook her head. Everyone deserves enough time to be heard. When breakfast arrived, Emily returned with crayons and several clean paper placemats from the supply cabinet. Soon the little boy was happily drawing skyscrapers while waiting for his pancakes. The dining room continued bustling around them. Yet for those few minutes, Emily made certain one small customer never felt overlooked. Across town, Daniel Brooks sat through another executive strategy meeting. Charts filled the presentation screen while directors discussed market expansion into 3 new states. Daniel listened carefully, asking precise questions whenever necessary, but his thoughts kept returning to an unexpected realization. During the past week, every accidental encounter with Emily had revealed exactly the same person. She had not changed depending on who was watching. Wealth did not impress her. Ordinary people did not disappear in her presence. She carried the same quiet respect into every conversation. That consistency fascinated him more than any impressive resume ever could. During a short break, Daniel walked into his private office and called his foundation director. "I would like a complete report on the Patient Family Assistance Program," he said. "Specifically, I want to understand why so many working families still struggle with long-term caregiving expenses." The director sounded surprised. "We can prepare that by tomorrow." "Thank you," Daniel replied before ending the call. He stood beside the large window overlooking the city. Before meeting Emily, caregiving had been another statistic within charitable reports. Now every number carried a human face. Every percentage represented someone balancing work, family, hospital visits, and hope without asking anyone for sympathy. That afternoon, Emily finished her shift and walked towards St. Margaret Medical Center carrying another small paper bag. This time it held fresh peaches because her father had mentioned them during their last conversation. As she entered the rehabilitation wing, she noticed one of the nurses struggling to calm a worried, elderly patient whose family had been delayed by heavy traffic. Without interrupting, Emily quietly approached and asked if she could sit with the woman for a few minutes. The nurse accepted gratefully. Emily spent nearly half an hour listening to stories about the woman's childhood farm in Pennsylvania, smiling at old family photographs stored inside a worn wallet, and reassuring her that loved ones sometimes arrived late because life became complicated, not because they cared any less. By the time the patient's daughter rushed through the hallway apologizing repeatedly, her mother was already smiling again. Emily slipped away before anyone could thank her. She preferred leaving peace behind rather than recognition. Unaware of any of this, Daniel finished another long day believing he had already learned everything that week could teach him. He did not yet realize that the greatest truths about Emily Carter were still hidden beneath the surface, waiting quietly behind the ordinary life she carried with such remarkable grace. Tuesday evening settled over Manhattan beneath a gentle drizzle that painted the sidewalks with reflections of passing headlights. Emily Carter pulled the hood of her light jacket over her hair as she stepped out of St. Margaret Medical Center after visiting her father. Robert had been unusually cheerful that afternoon, proudly telling every nurse that he had managed another therapy milestone. Emily celebrated every small victory because she understood that healing rarely arrived all at once. It came one determined step at a time. Before heading to the subway, she stopped at a small neighborhood bookstore that was preparing to close. The owner greeted her with a familiar smile and quietly handed her a paper bag containing several used medical textbooks that had recently been donated. "I saved these for you," he said. Emily looked surprised. "You remembered?" The elderly owner nodded. "You once mentioned you missed studying." She carefully opened the bag, gently running her fingers across the worn covers. Rehabilitation science, neuromuscular recovery, patient mobility assessment. Books she had once dreamed of reading every day inside a university classroom instead of borrowing whenever she could. "How much do I owe you?" she asked softly. The owner smiled. "One promise." Emily looked up. "Finish reading them." Her eyes glistened with quiet gratitude. "That is a promise I can keep." At nearly the same hour, Daniel Brooks sat alone inside his office long after most of the building had emptied. His foundation director entered carrying the report he had requested the previous day. "You wanted background information on long-term family caregivers," she said while placing the folder on his desk. Daniel thanked her before opening the report. It contained statistics, policy recommendations, financial projections, and dozens of personal case studies describing people who had paused careers, postponed education, or accepted lower-paying jobs in order to care for aging parents or disabled family members. One profile immediately caught his attention. Emily Carter. The foundation had never supported her directly, but her circumstances had appeared in a hospital outreach assessment completed nearly 3 years earlier. Daniel read every line slowly. Emily had graduated near the top of her high school class and earned admission into one of New York's respected physical therapy programs. During her second year, her father suffered a severe stroke that changed everything. Between hospital bills, rehabilitation costs, and the need for daily care, continuing full-time education became impossible. She quietly withdrew from the university, accepted restaurant work with flexible hours, and devoted herself to supporting both her father and his recovery. There were no complaints recorded, no requests for special assistance beyond basic hospital payment plans. She had simply adapted her life without asking the world to feel sorry for her. Daniel leaned back in silence. Suddenly, countless small moments made perfect sense. The confidence with which she encouraged rehabilitation patients. The patience she showed elderly strangers. The calm way she instinctively noticed physical limitations that others overlooked. None of those qualities had appeared by accident. They had been shaped through years of sacrifice that almost nobody had witnessed. His assistant quietly entered the office carrying the last documents requiring his signature. She noticed the open file resting on his desk. "Everything all right?" Daniel nodded. Slowly. "Do you know what impresses me?" She waited. Many people become kind after life has been easy. She remained kind after life became difficult. The assistant glanced toward the file before asking carefully, "Will you contact her?" Daniel closed the folder with deliberate care. "Not yet." He walked toward the window overlooking the glowing skyline. "If I ever do, it cannot be because I feel sorry for her. Pity disappears quickly. Respect lasts." Meanwhile, Emily arrived home carrying the borrowed textbooks beneath one arm. Her apartment was small but warm, filled with family photographs, secondhand furniture, and quiet reminders of the life she had built through determination rather than comfort. She placed the books neatly on the kitchen table before preparing a simple dinner. Later that evening, after paying monthly bills and organizing her father's therapy schedule, she opened the first textbook and began reading as though she had never left school at all. Outside, the rain continued falling against the apartment windows while the city hurried through another ordinary night. Inside that modest apartment, a forgotten dream quietly refused to disappear. And several miles away, a billionaire who had spent his life recognizing valuable investments was beginning to realize that the greatest potential he had ever encountered could never be measured in dollars, only in courage, compassion, and the quiet strength to keep moving forward when no one was watching. Thursday morning began with an unexpected phone call that changed the rhythm of Daniel Brooks's carefully organized day. He had just stepped into the boardroom when his personal assistant approached with unusual urgency. "Your father called twice before breakfast," she said quietly. "He insisted he was fine, but your house manager believes he should be examined." Daniel did not hesitate. Meetings could be rescheduled. Family could not. Less than an hour later, he arrived at St. Margaret Medical Center with his father, William Brooks, who insisted the entire visit was unnecessary. I only felt a little dizzy, the older man said with a dismissive wave of his hand. That happens when you reach my age. Daniel smiled patiently. It also happens when you skip breakfast because you are too stubborn to admit you need help. William laughed, but Daniel noticed the fatigue behind his father's familiar confidence. After the initial examination, nurses guided William toward the rehabilitation wing while routine evaluations continued. Daniel remained nearby, answering messages on his phone, although his attention drifted constantly toward the hallway where patients quietly practiced walking, balancing, and rebuilding everyday skills that most people took for granted. It reminded him of the report he had read only 2 nights earlier. Suddenly, he noticed a familiar figure walking through the corridor carrying a reusable shopping bag and several library books pressed gently against her side. Emily Carter stopped outside room 412 before smiling at one of the therapists who greeted her by name. Daniel remained where he was, unnoticed among visitors waiting outside examination rooms. A few minutes later, an elderly patient several doors away became visibly anxious after learning that a scheduled family visit would be delayed because of heavy traffic leaving New Jersey. The woman repeatedly asked the same worried questions while the already busy nurse attempted to reassure 3 different patients at once. Before anyone requested assistance, Emily quietly stepped forward. She pulled a chair beside the woman instead of standing over her. "Would you like to tell me about your favorite place to visit when you were younger?" she asked gently. The unexpected question interrupted the cycle of anxious thoughts. The woman's face softened almost immediately. She began describing summers spent beside a lake in northern Michigan, fishing with her brothers before sunrise, and eating blueberry pie every Sunday afternoon. Emily listened with complete attention, smiling at every memory as though she had nowhere else she needed to be. The nurse caught Daniel's eye from across the hallway and quietly mouthed 2 words. "She always." Daniel looked confused until the nurse walked over during a brief pause. "She does this almost every visit," the nurse explained softly. "Nobody asks her to. If someone looks frightened or lonely, she simply sits with them until they feel better." Daniel glanced toward Emily again. "She is here to visit her father." "Yes," the nurse replied. "But somehow she always notices everyone else's family too." Several minutes later, another therapist approached Emily outside her father's room, carrying a folder. Daniel could not hear every word, but he caught enough to understand the conversation. "You still remember every exercise," the therapist said with an impressed smile. "You explain them almost as well as our staff." Emily laughed quietly. "I have had plenty of practice." "Have you ever considered coming back?" the therapist asked. Emily looked toward her father's room before answering. "Every day." There was no bitterness in her voice, only honesty. "Maybe someday. Right now my father needs me more than my plans need me." The therapist nodded with understanding before returning to work. Daniel remained completely still. Those simple words carried more weight than any motivational speech he had ever heard. Emily had not abandoned her dream because she lacked ability. She had postponed it because love had required something different from her. At that moment, William Brooks emerged slowly from his examination room, leaning lightly on a cane. Emily noticed the older gentleman adjusting his balance before anyone else did. Without making a scene, she stepped forward with the calm confidence Daniel had seen so many times before. "Take your time," she said warmly to William. "There is no prize for reaching the elevator first." William smiled at the unexpected encouragement. "That may be the kindest advice I have heard all week." Emily returned the smile. "Small steps still move you forward." She continued walking toward her father's room, unaware that Daniel was watching every quiet moment. His father looked after her for a second before turning to his son. "She reminds me of your mother," William said softly. "Not because they look alike, because she makes people feel safe without trying to impress them." Daniel watched Emily disappear behind room 412, and for the first time since that evening at the charity gala, he understood that what kept drawing him back was not curiosity alone. It was admiration for a woman who had quietly become the strongest person in every room she entered without ever asking anyone to notice. The following Monday, sunlight poured through the tall windows of Brooks Capital as Daniel Brooks stood before a room filled with foundation directors, financial officers, and community advisors. Normally, these quarterly meetings revolved around budgets, measurable outcomes, and carefully calculated projections. That morning was different. Daniel closed the presentation on the large screen before anyone expected him to speak. I have spent years believing that solving problems always begins with writing a larger check, he said calmly. Last week reminded me that sometimes people do not need someone to rescue them. They need someone to remove the obstacles that prevent them from moving forward. The room fell quiet. Several executives exchanged curious glances. Daniel continued, I want to establish a new scholarship and caregiver support initiative. It will help students who had to pause their education because they became full-time caregivers for parents or close family members. Tuition assistance will be only one part of it. Flexible scheduling, transportation support, rehabilitation partnerships, and mentoring will matter just as much. The foundation director looked genuinely surprised. This would become one of our largest community investments. Daniel nodded. Then let us make it one of our most meaningful. While plans for the new initiative quietly began taking shape across the city, Emily Carter continued living exactly as she always had. She finished breakfast service before taking the subway to St. Margaret Medical Center, carrying another stack of library books and a small container of homemade chicken soup that one of her neighbors had insisted Robert would enjoy. Her father was waiting with an excited smile. Guess what happened today? He asked before she even reached the chair beside his bed. Emily laughed. Knowing you, I have no idea. Robert pointed proudly toward his walker. I walked nearly twice as far during therapy. Emily's face brightened. With unmistakable joy. That is wonderful. Robert shrugged modestly. The therapist says I still have a long road ahead. Emily gently squeezed his shoulder. Long roads are traveled one step at a time. Later that afternoon, while Robert rested, Emily wandered into the rehabilitation gym, where several patients practiced everyday movements under the guidance of therapists. One elderly gentleman struggled to organize a simple sequence of balance exercises after becoming frustrated with himself. Emily quietly approached only after receiving an encouraging nod from the supervising therapist. Would you like to try thinking about it differently? She asked kindly. The man sighed. I keep forgetting the order. Emily smiled warmly. Do you cook? He looked puzzled. Every Sunday. Then imagine each movement is one ingredient. You do not bake the pie all at once. You add one thing at a time. The man's expression softened with understanding. Together, they slowly repeated each movement until confidence replaced frustration. Watching from across the room, the supervising therapist quietly shook her head in amazement. You explain rehabilitation the way experienced clinicians do, she said after the patient finished successfully. Emily smiled modestly. I only explain it the way someone once explained it to my father. The therapist folded her arms thoughtfully. Have you truly given up on becoming a physical therapist? Emily looked around the room where determined patients celebrated every small improvement. No, she answered honestly. Dreams do not disappear. Sometimes they simply learn how to wait. Those words stayed with the therapist long after Emily returned to her father's room. 2 days later, an official envelope arrived at Emily's apartment. She assumed it was another medical statement and placed it on the kitchen table until after dinner. Only when she finally opened it did she realize it carried the letterhead of the Brooks Foundation. She carefully unfolded the pages. The foundation announced the creation of a new program supporting family caregivers whose education had been interrupted by long-term responsibility at home. Applicants were invited to attend an informational event the following week. Tuition assistance, academic partnerships, and career pathways would all be discussed. Emily read the letter twice before setting it down. She never imagined someone had created a program that sounded almost identical to the life she had been living. Across town, Daniel reviewed the final proposal before quietly signing the authorization. His assistant smiled. The program is officially approved. Daniel placed the pen on his desk and looked toward the Manhattan skyline. He thought briefly about the quiet waitress who still believed the world had never noticed her sacrifices. He had no intention of giving her special treatment or offering favors she had not earned. If she chose to apply, she would stand beside every other caregiver who had quietly carried impossible responsibilities with dignity. That was exactly how she would have wanted it. And somehow, Daniel knew that if the program changed even one life, the greatest gift would not belong to the person receiving the opportunity. It would belong to everyone finally learning to recognize the quiet strength that had been standing beside them all along. Nearly 1 year later, the first morning of autumn painted Manhattan with crisp blue skies and cool air that carried the quiet promise of new beginnings. Inside the auditorium of the Brooks Foundation, dozens of students, caregivers, medical professionals, and community leaders gathered for the annual celebration of the Caregiver Scholar Initiative. Stories filled the room that no financial report could ever measure. A son who had returned to nursing school after caring for his mother. A single father who finally completed his engineering degree while raising 2 children. A daughter who had delayed her dreams for years before discovering that compassion had not placed her behind in life. It had prepared her for it. Daniel Brooks stood near the back of the room instead of on the stage. He preferred watching the conversations unfold naturally. Laughter echoed between tables. Families embraced one another. Volunteers welcomed every guest with genuine warmth. The atmosphere felt very different from the polished charity gala where this unexpected journey had quietly begun. There were no crystal chandeliers, no luxury auction items, only ordinary people celebrating extraordinary perseverance. As the audience settled into their seats, the foundation director stepped onto the stage with a welcoming smile. Before we recognize this year's graduating scholars, I would like to introduce someone many of you already know. She was among the very first applicants to this program, and today she serves as both a mentor and coordinator for new caregiver families entering our community. Emily Carter walked onto the stage wearing a simple navy blue dress and the same calm expression that had always defined her. The applause that filled the room was warm and heartfelt, yet she seemed almost surprised to receive it. She thanked everyone with quiet humility before speaking. There was a time when I believed putting my education on hold meant leaving my future behind. I eventually learned that caring for someone you love is never time wasted. It teaches patience, resilience, compassion, and perspective. When I finally returned to school, I realized those lessons had become the strongest part of my education. She paused for a moment, looking towards several families seated in the front rows. If you are caring for someone today and wondering whether your dreams still matter, I hope you remember this. Dreams can wait without disappearing. Kindness never delays your future. It shapes the person who will eventually reach it. The audience rose together in a standing ovation. Daniel remained still for a brief moment before quietly joining everyone else. His father, William Brooks, standing beside him with only a light cane now, smiled knowingly. "I told you she reminds me of your mother," he whispered. Daniel nodded without taking his eyes off the stage. "You were right." After the ceremony ended, guests slowly drifted toward the reception hall where coffee, sandwiches, and homemade desserts waited on long wooden tables. Emily stepped outside for a few minutes of fresh air, enjoying the peaceful silence after an emotional afternoon. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Daniel, approaching with 2 paper cups of coffee. "I was hoping you might have a few minutes," he said with a gentle smile. Emily accepted one of the cups gratefully. "Thank you." They stood together overlooking the city without speaking for a while. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "There is something I have wanted to tell you since the charity gala last year." Emily looked at him with quiet curiosity. Daniel smiled softly. "You thanked me for helping you that evening. The truth is, I have spent the past year realizing that you were the one who changed my life." Emily shook her head with a modest laugh. "I think you are giving me far too much credit." "No," Daniel replied. "You reminded me that success is not measured by how many people recognize your name. It is measured by how many people feel seen because you entered their lives." Emily looked down at the coffee cup, warming her hands before answering. "My father used to tell me that everyone is carrying something invisible. If we remember that, kindness becomes much easier." Daniel smiled. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He is." They watched people leaving the building together, families laughing, students carrying new textbooks, elderly couples walking slowly beneath the changing leaves. Life continued exactly as it always had, filled with ordinary moments waiting for someone to notice them. Daniel glanced toward Emily one last time. "Would you have dinner with me sometime? Not to celebrate the program. Not because I am a billionaire. Just because I would like the chance to know the person who quietly reminded me what truly matters." Emily met his eyes and smiled with the same quiet sincerity she had carried from the very beginning. "I would like that." They walked back inside side by side. not because either of them had rescued the other, but because both had discovered that the strongest relationships begin with mutual respect. And somewhere between one unnoticed act of kindness and another, two ordinary lives had quietly changed forever. Sometimes the greatest rescue is not pulling someone out of danger. Sometimes it is helping another person remember the kind of human being they always hoped to become.